All right, welcome to this explainer. Today, we are going to completely demystify the magic behind every single website on the internet. Have you ever looked at a massive, super complex web page and thought, how on earth did they actually build this? Well, we're going to break it down today using a really powerful real-world analogy. I want you to think of building a website exactly like building a house. You don't just start with the paint and the furniture, right? You start with a blueprint. You pour a solid foundation, frame the walls, and only then do you start decorating. By the end of this journey, you're going to see code not as some confusing wall of text, but as a perfectly logical set of architectural instructions. Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our roadmap to banish any of that technical overwhelm. 1. The anatomy of a website. 2. HTML, our foundation. 3. Content and media. 4. Collecting user input. 5. CSS styling. And finally, 6. The CSS box model. So, Part 1, the anatomy of a website and the division of labor. Before we even touch a single line of code, we really need to zoom out a bit. When you visit a digital house, there's a very strict division of labor going on. On one side, we have the front end. This is literally everything your guests see, the interface, the text, the layout, and it's happening right there on their device. On the other side is the back end. Now, this is the plumbing and electricity hidden deep behind the walls, running on some distant server to process data securely. A full-stack developer is basically just someone who knows how to build both that visible house and the invisible plumbing. There's a great quote from the source material that perfectly cements how the front end is constructed. In a website, HTML is the structure, CSS is the style, and JavaScript is the functionality. So, if the web page is a house, HTML is telling us how many bedrooms we have. CSS is deciding the color of the exterior brick. And JavaScript, that's what allows you to actually open the front door or turn on the lights. Moving to Part 2, HTML, the foundation. We're framing the walls. Grab your hard hats because it's time to pour that digital foundation using HTML, hypertext markup language. Now, do not let that technical name intimidate you. It is simply the standard language used to describe the structure of a web page. Every single website on the internet uses this to tell the browser, hey, this is a heading, this is a paragraph, and over here, this is an image. Honestly, writing HTML is like learning a super simple, incredibly logical grammar rule. Everything is built using these things we call tags. Step 1 is the opening tag, tucked inside angle brackets, like a P for paragraph. Step 2 is the actual content you want your user to see, say the text "Hello World." And step 3 is the closing tag, which looks identical to the opening tag, but it has a little forward slash to tell the browser, okay, the paragraph ends exactly right here. Boom. That's it. You've literally just framed your first digital wall.
All right, Part 3, Content and Media. Time to furnish the rooms.
Now, what's really interesting about this is how progressive disclosure helps group these tags logically. You don't have to memorize thousands of different commands. If you want a heading, you just use an H tag, and they just descend in size from H1 down to H6. Want standard text? Just use that P tag for a paragraph. Linking to another page, you use an A tag, which stands for anchor. And a picture simply uses an IMG tag. It's a remarkably intuitive pattern once you get the hang of it. But sometimes a tag just needs a little bit more info. An image tag obviously needs to know exactly what picture to show, right? That is where HTML attributes come in. Think of attributes as these detailed micro blueprints embedded right inside that opening tag. So for an anchor tag, an attribute called href tells the browser the exact URL it needs to point to. For an image tag, the src or source attribute tells the browser exactly where to go fetch that photo. Which brings us to Part 4, collecting user input or building the mailbox. So our house is looking pretty good, but right now it's a total one-way street. To let guests actually leave us a message, we set up a digital mailbox using HTML forms, and these forms are endlessly versatile. Just by changing one little type attribute, you can collect open text for names, strict numbers, multiple choice checkboxes, or radio buttons. And of course, you absolutely need the submit button, because without that, your mailbox is pretty much jammed shut. Now, when that submit button gets clicked, our form packages up the letter and sends it off to the server, but how it sends it really matters. If your form uses the get method, the data being sent is completely visible right up there in your browser's URL bar. It's kind of like sending a postcard where literally anyone can read the message in transit. But if you use the post method, the data is hidden from the URL, like sealing your letter safely inside an envelope. Obviously, that is absolutely crucial for things like passwords.
Okay, so we have a fully functional house at this point. The walls are up, the furniture is moved in, the mailbox is taking letters. But let's be honest with ourselves. Right now, it is just raw brick and exposed wood. How do we take this bare-bones structure and make it truly beautiful?
That is part 5, CSS, styling the web. Time to paint the walls. This is the climax of our whole journey. Let's bring in the interior designer of the web, CSS, which stands for Cascading Style Sheets. If HTML is the bare skeleton, CSS is the skin and the clothing. It is a completely separate language dedicated entirely to design, so applying colors, messing with typography, and dictating the exact layout positioning of our HTML structure. And this brilliantly illustrates how it actually works. The core syntax of CSS is dead simple. Every rule just has 2 parts. First, you have the selector, which identifies exactly which wall we want to target. Second is the declaration, which is housed inside these little curly braces. The declaration is the specific command itself, like setting a property of color to a value of blue. So you just select the target and then you declare the style. Because think about it, an architect needs precise tools to target exactly which room gets painted, right? CSS gives us different levels of selectors to do just that. You can target a raw element, like telling it to paint every single H1 tag on the page green. You can use an ID selector, marked with a hashtag, to target one single, highly specific, unique element. You can use a class selector, marked with a dot, to style a whole specific group of elements all at once. Or you can just use the universal selector, the asterisk, to apply a style to literally every single thing on the page.
Finally, part 6, the CSS box model, the invisible architecture.
So now that we know how to apply the paint, we need to reveal the invisible architecture that governs physical space on the web. Guys, here is the absolute secret to web design. Everything in HTML is fundamentally a box. Literally everything. And every single box is controlled by 3 distinct layers: the visible border wall, the padding inside that wall, and the margin outside. Understanding this right now prevents the #1 source of confusion for beginners down the road. The spatial difference here is what's absolutely crucial. Padding is the invisible space inside your border. If you add padding, you are physically expanding the inside of the room, pushing the text away from its own walls. Margin, on the flip side, is the invisible space outside the border. So if you add margin, you are expanding the outside yard, basically pushing neighboring elements further away from your house. Once you really understand that every single element is just a box with padding, borders, and margins, CSS gives you limitless power to shape them. You can strictly define the width and height of these boxes using hard pixels, or make them flexible with percentages. You can style the borders to be thick, dashed, dotted, whatever you want. You can even use the border radius property to instantly smooth out those sharp square corners into beautiful, modern, rounded shapes. You truly have total architectural control over your digital house. And honestly, this is the most empowering realization of all. Whether you're looking at a tiny, single-page personal blog or a massive, world-changing platform like Google, if you right-click and inspect the page, you're going to see these exact same fundamental building blocks. It is all just HTML structure shaped and colored by CSS declarations. The complexity you see just comes from how brilliantly developers arrange those simple boxes. You now possess the foundational blueprints. You know exactly how to frame the walls with HTML, how to collect input from your visitors, and how to beautifully paint and arrange those elements using CSS and the box model. The tools are literally right there in your browser, just waiting for your instructions. So with all this architectural power sitting right at your fingertips, what are you going to build next? Thank you so much for hanging out with me for this explainer, and I'll catch you in the next one.